We welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to an exhibit of art. A collection of oils and still lifes that share one thing in common. You won't find them in the average salon, or exhibition hall, or art museum. With that, Rod Serling begins to introduce the first tale of the Night Gallery, Season 1. And where do we begin our journey into the macabre? Why, with disease and death, of course.
You wouldn't give up your practice to concentrate on the healthy individual. So, what's wrong with him?
You're the diagnostician. I'm not in your class. But then who is?
I'm flattered, but it doesn't take a diagnostician to remark that a man looks well. If you want a diagnosis...
Oh, I hardly think that's necessary. His ailment would appear to me to be quite obvious. My first-year medical student could see it.
What?
Look again.
What's happened to him?
You still maintain he looks well?
The Dead Man was directed and written by Douglas Hayes, based on a short story by Fritz Leiber. The name Douglas Hayes should be familiar to you as a director from The Twilight Zone. My personal favorite director, I might add. But here we get to see his writing skills on display as well. We're exploring grim science along with Dr. Max Redford, played by Carl Betts, and Dr. Miles Talmadge, played by Jeff Corey. Miles is a diagnostician who has been summoned to the estate and private practice of Max, who's a psychologist or something? The tale opens with Miles being driven up to a massive mansion and met by Max at the door, who welcomes him warmly. Miles has been called in to give his professional opinion on a special patient. Miles notes that Max has no patients in his waiting room, and Max admits he's abandoned his practice to pursue the study of this one case. Whatever his practice was, it was good. This mansion would put some A-list actors to shame. Miles enters Max's clinic room and is introduced to John Fearing, his one and only patient, in a deep sleep, leading to the scene I showed you. Max continues to seemingly lead John through a few terrible diseases before he is suddenly returned to full health and strength. John gets up, shakes the doctor's hand, and heads out to get dressed for dinner. He lives here, you see. Miles is flabbergasted, and Max explains that John was a severe hypochondriac who brings a new definition to mind over matter. Every symptom he's ever had is placebo.
But his body is still slavishly obedient to suggestion, except that now it's controlled by a stronger mentality.
He doesn't strike me as cerebral, even now.
Not his mentality, mine.
Hypnosis?
The image of every disease he does, as he puts it, has been planted in his subconscious by me.
Of course, that annoying tic I was afraid you developed, those rappings with a pencil. Those were cues to execute commands given earlier, during the trance.
Exactly. He can't do a thing until he gets the proper signal.
In each case, there was a different pattern to trigger a different response, a different illness.
The most important and significant response was the last one. The complete absence of illness. Perfect health.
The doctors converse, and continue to converse, in a way that blends professionalism and familiarity well. I really get a sense that these two characters respect each other and are dear friends. You might have gotten the sense that this is a slow burn. We're almost 10 minutes in, and we haven't been introduced to a real conflict. But I was perfectly content with that, since I was intrigued at the speculative medical concepts being explored. Max goes on to say that he is hoping John Fearing will lead him to understanding what makes his brain so dominant as to create and uncreate disease, and then hopefully transfer that ability to others. He even talks about using this ascended placebo effect to bring people back to life. Uh-oh. Crazy scientist vibes. Miles admits to being impressed, but is obviously wary at the whole conquering death thing. Their conversation is interrupted by the appearance of Max's wife, Velia, who invites them both to dinner. And here, we are introduced to an interpersonal conflict. It is abundantly clear to all, audience included, that Velia is completely smitten with John. They even hold hands at one point.
You see them at dinner? She never took her eyes off.
You do nothing to discourage it.
How else can I keep him here? He doesn't need me. He's got money as well as everything else. If it weren't for Delia, he'd be skiing in Switzerland or sunning himself in the south of France. You know, this work we do here isn't pleasant for him.
Then do it elsewhere. I'll give you space in my own clinic. Remove your work from your home and get him out.
Miles, don't you see? I can't separate them. If I do, I'll lose him.
That's more important than losing her?
I love her, Miles. She's been my life, you know that. Fearing. My immortality.
If it's worth that much to you, accept the price and get on with the work.
I try. I've done it so far, but the truth is I'm not that clinical.
Max continues, clearly torn between completing his work and keeping his wife. At no point in the narrative is the burden put on Velia to be, I don't know, not a cheating arsehole, but they're tightening the focus to the Doctor characters. I can understand that. Anyways, Max laughs at the irony of his situation. By creating the healthiest man alive, he's created the perfect man. How can he compete with that? Miles suggests ending the project, and Max admits to thoughts of using his mental influence over John to turn him into a grotesque monster, or just flat out kill him. Miles tells him off, and Max asks if Miles thinks he's capable of killing someone, to which Miles just gives him a blank stare. We hard cut to the next day, and Miles is called into the clinic. He sees John unconscious on the table. At least he looks unconscious, but John has no pulse.
Last night, I asked you for a definition of death. Here is death, Doctor. Perfectly counterfeited. Death in life. And I would defy any medical authority on Earth to prove this man alive.
You instructed him to be dead?
Yes.
I don't like this, Max. Get him out of it.
Watch. Touch him.
Rigor mortis. That's enough, Max. Bring him out. For heaven's sake, Max, bring him out. I don't know what you think you're trying to prove, but I know what you're doing. And you can't. Not to him, not to Velia.
Don't know what you're saying. You can't believe that. You know me better, Miles.
I thought so. Now prove it. Bring him out!
You'll see. You're wrong, Miles. You'll see.
Despite Max's repeated attempts to bring John out of it, nothing works. Max hammers out the signal to resurrect him, but it would seem the suggestion of death is just as good as the real thing. Velia runs in hearing the commotion and, realizing John has died, wails over his body, blaming Max for it. It's a legitimately tense scene as we watch Max desperately try to bring him back, and I confess to being gripped by the episode at this point. We cut to some time later, and a string of doctors in surgical scrubs marches out of the clinic room. Max and Miles are with them. Clearly they've just come out of a traditional surgery to save John, but nothing has worked. Miles sits and comforts Velia, who is grief-stricken, saying Max did everything he could, but she walks away, basically suicidal in her tone of voice. And I feel kind of sorry for her, but I mean, she was cheating on her husband with this walking Ken doll, so I'm not gushing with sympathy or anything. I do appreciate that the episode doesn't start focusing in on her, or trying to make you feel a certain way. We then cut to a few days later, and a funeral service is being held for John in a nearby cemetery. Velia is near catatonic at this point.
We used to joke about it. A cemetery so close to the hospital. The walk will do me good.
You shouldn't be alone.
I've always been alone.
Keep in mind that Max's house is very close to this cemetery. That'll matter later. We time skip an indeterminate amount of time, and Miles has returned to the house for another visit. Velia opens the door, but barely recognizes him. She's basically a broken shell of the person she once was, and just wanders around the house in a daze. Miles sees Max, who tells him that he summoned him so he can give him his research material and tapes from his hypnosis sessions with John. As he hands it over, it's obvious that Max is racked with guilt over John's death, convinced that he subconsciously wanted John to die on that table. Miles tries to comfort him, but it doesn't really take. Miles collects up the tapes and notes, and that night we see him reviewing the session where Max implanted the death command and the subsequent Lazarus suggestion to come out of it.
The illusion of death will be dispelled completely. You will return to full and vibrant life when you hear this signal. Now listen, John.
Did you catch it? Well, Miles did. Max gave the wrong signal to revive John. Miles wakes Max up in the middle of the night and tells him frantically what happened. The signal on the tape and the one he used in the clinic were different. On some unconscious level, Max really did try to off John. Or so it would seem. We don't get to see the exact end of that conversation because both men become aware that Velia has overheard them, and she darts out of the house immediately. She's running back to the graveyard to wake up John. Max runs after her immediately, but Miles stops to grab a flashlight from his car before following. Miles gets to the graveyard, and we switch to a first-person viewpoint, and... It's not the debut I was expecting, but nevertheless, I was pleasantly surprised by this tale. Clocking in at just over 30 minutes, it's a long runner, and could have been a snore fest. But instead, it uses its runtime extremely well, establishing the speculative medical concept, and presenting us with our characters in a very natural and well-constructed way. The actors all do a great job, and the episode looks great. It is Douglas Hayes at the helm, after all. The ultimate litmus test is the big question. Is this a good horror story? Well, in my opinion, yes. Sure, it's not viscerally frightening, and your mileage will vary on the visuals of Zombie John at the end there, but the twisted variation of mind over matter, the idea that your brain could convince your body to just drop dead, well, that's pretty horrific. And creative, original, and memorable. All great traits. Good first impression, Night Gallery. Here's to more. It's 3 out of 3 fedoras from me.